Şimdi ikinci konuşmacımız Edmund Herzig hocamızı kürsüye davet ediyorum. Oxford Üniversitesi Oriental Studies'den Persian Studies çalışmalarından geliyor. İran çalışmalarından. O bağlamda da İran, Hindistan, İran zaten bugün konuşmasında Cuffa ile ilgili çalışmaları var. Bir önce söylediğim gibi aslında Mehmet Hoca'nın anlattıklarını büyük oranda tamamlayacak bir tema. Kendisine çok teşekkür ediyoruz geldiği için. Your headphone is not on, but
first, my thanks to Father Levon Zekian for inviting me, to colleagues in BİLGİ University. It's my first time in this very nice campus. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak for the first time at this university. I would also like to begin just by saying how encouraged I was in the Q&A at the end of the last excellent paper to hear that people are learning Armenian in order to access the information that is contained within the very rich surviving documentation in the Armenian language relating to the history of trade, economy, society, a range of issues in the Ottoman Empire. I've made my own work looking at Armenian sources for Safavid history, and I took that path mainly because I realized early in my career, really at the start of my PhD, that if I wanted to work on commercial history of the Safavid Empire, there was much more to be done using Armenian sources than there was using Persian sources. There is a huge mass of documentation in Armenian, account books, letters, contracts of all kinds, which we simply don't have in Persian for the Iranian merchants, or if it exists, at least nobody has yet discovered it and started to work with it. I'm going to speak, I hope, slowly and clearly, because I know a number of you are listening to an interpretation. I apologize for the fact that I don't have Turkish, so I want to thank the interpreters for their labors and to ask those of you who are listening through interpretation that if I'm going too fast or if the interpretation is not coming through to you, please wave your hands, let me know, and I will try to speak a little slower and a little clearer. Okay, so to my paper, which is on Armenians in India in the 17th and 18th centuries, and I'm looking at commercial mainly, but also to some extent cultural and intellectual connections. Sometime in the late 1690s, in a local courtroom in Lhasa, in Tibet, an Armenian merchant called Hovhannes Davtyan, or John, the son of the priest David, lost a commercial dispute on a dice roll. What was an Armenian merchant doing so far from home in Tibet at the end of the 17th century? To answer that question, we need to travel far to the west, to Julfa, a small town and river crossing on the river Aras, which today is located on the border between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic of the Republic of Azerbaijan. And we need to go back in time from the late 17th century to the middle or second half of the 16th century, because that is the time when the Julfa Armenians, and really I'm talking entirely about the Julfa Armenians in this presentation, when the Julfa Armenians first achieved more than local recognition. At that time, the main export commodity of the Safavid Empire was raw silk. Raw silk that was grown in the Caspian provinces of the empire, Mazandaran, Gilan, Shirvan, Aran, so the south and west coasts of the Caspian Sea. And already this was a well-established industry and it was an important source of raw silk for the looms of the Ottoman silk industry, silk manufacturing industry in Bursa and elsewhere. Until the second half of the 16th century, while Armenians probably participated in that trade, they are not mentioned as being especially important or dominant compared to merchants of other nationalities. We presume, in fact, that most of the trade was being carried by Muslim merchants, probably Shirvanis or Azerbaijanis. In the course of the 16th century, however, the destination of most of that Iranian silk began to shift from Bursa to Aleppo, and then from Aleppo also to Smyrna, to Izmir. And we have a process in which increasingly it is European merchants sailing across the Mediterranean and coming to Iskenderun, Alexandretta, or to Izmir, who are able to buy the majority of the Iranian raw silk export. This is a period when European merchants have their purses stuffed with silver coin, ultimately from the New World silver mines of the Spanish Empire, and it's a period when European silk manufacture is developing rapidly and is increasingly able to compete or outcompete the Ottoman silk industry of Bursa and other places. It seems, and we don't have definite evidence of this, but it seems that the Armenians were able to take advantage of this shift in direction of the silk trade from Bursa to Aleppo, and this shift in purchases from Ottoman manufacturers to European merchants supplying European manufacturers to expand their role in the trade. Here, I think we can see for the first time the advantage that Armenians as Middle Eastern Christians had in acting as intermediaries between European Christian merchants and Muslim Middle Eastern producers or officials or other merchants. By the end of the century, many of the European sources, and Europeans are very interested in this subject, are describing the Julfans as having a monopoly of this trade. I don't believe they ever had a monopoly of the trade. I think this simply means that the Europeans were only buying from Julfa Armenians. But it does appear that the Julfans had become the dominant community trading Iranian raw silk to Aleppo at any rate. So by this time, these merchants have established themselves on an important circuit of international trade of this period, a trade which is essentially a circuit in which raw silk went from the Caspian and silver came from the Mediterranean. And I perhaps should just say that we're not here talking about that Silk Road which everybody loves to talk about these days, the Silk Road that UNESCO likes as a symbol of the connectivity of civilizations, the Silk Roads that China loves as a soft way of selling its one belt, one road strategy. So this is a very particular, time-limited trade going just from Iran across the Ottoman Empire to the Mediterranean. So no Silk Roads, please. This is just a trade in silk in a specific time and place. And it's raw silk, not silk textiles. This still does not take us very far towards explaining what John, the son of the priest David, was doing in Lhasa about 100 years later. He was a Julfan, but he was a very long way from Aleppo or from the silk-producing provinces of southwest of the Caspian Sea. To understand what took John and people like him in an entirely different direction to the east, to India, we need to add a political dimension to our story. And here we enter the context of the Ottoman-Safavid Wars of the late 16th century. So after a period of peace following the signature of the Treaty of Amasya in 1555, in the 1570s, Safavid state is in one of its periodic periods of crisis, and the Ottomans take advantage, and a series of campaigns are fought across the frontier between the two empires, devastating campaigns for much of the territory that was crossed by the armies. Devastating not just because of the usual damage caused by armies traveling through territories, taking towns, sacking cities, but because the Safavids regularly employed scorched earth tactics. Ever since Chaldiran in 1514, the Safavids had been reluctant to face Ottoman armies in the field of battle, and so they had preferred to withdraw before them, making life as difficult as possible for the advancing Ottoman troops. They knew that the Ottomans started way back here in Istanbul, and by the time they reached the Safavid frontier, already they were thinking about going home for the winter. And if they could simply delay them for long enough, then the Ottomans would return before they reached Tabriz or any of the other major Safavid cities. Excuse me. And it was these scorched earth operations in which Safavids from Shah Tahmasp onwards moved very large numbers of people, usually temporarily, short-term, tactical expedient, and burned the land, destroyed the crops, and often torched the villages. At some point in the course of these campaigns, Julfa, like the whole of that area, passed into Ottoman hands in the late 15th century. It's not actually mentioned in chronicles, or at least I haven't found it. And it remained in Ottoman hands for 25 years until it was retaken by Shah Abbas I in his great campaign of 1603 to 1604, where he first recovered Tabriz from the Ottomans, and then the campaign culminated in the siege of Yerevan. For the Safavids, this was an enormous military achievement. They had never before been able to capture a major fortified Ottoman city, and Yerevan was a very well fortified city. So, by the end of the summer of 1604, Abbas had taken Yerevan, and the Ottomans had launched a rather belated counter-attack, and their armies reached the border area only in the autumn of 1604. And at that point, Abbas did what his grandfather had done, and he resorted to scorched earth. He was taken, in fact, by surprise. He'd sent most of his army into winter quarters. He had no intention of fighting the Ottomans, and he simply deported, depopulated the route forward for the Ottoman Empire, for the Ottoman army. This is a traumatic moment in the history of this region. It didn't only affect Armenians, it affected the entire population, so many Muslims of many varieties, Kurds, Turks, Iranians were involved as well. And it also involved Julfa. In fact, Julfa was the place where Abbas's army crossed the river, retreating rapidly before the advancing Ottomans, and the town was emptied, destroyed, and the Julfans participated in this deportation. But the Julfans, unlike most of the rest of the deportees, were given special treatment. The king looked after them, he provided them with beasts of burden to transport their belongings, and during the winter that followed, when most of the deportees were in the mountains, suffering from the cold and from considerable hardship, the Julfans were taken to Tabriz, and they were given relatively comfortable living conditions. And then the following spring, when the Ottoman army had gone away, and when most of the deportees were allowed to return to their homes, the Julfans were not allowed to return and rebuild old Julfa on place, but instead they were transported to the new Safavid capital, Isfahan. And there they were permitted, encouraged to build a suburb, a special suburb, Armenian suburb, on the other side of the river from Isfahan, a suburb which was named, perhaps predictably, Norjuha, New Julfa. The Shah allocated them land, he gave them resources, he gave them privileges, the right to worship by their own religion, the right to build churches, which was irritating to some of the Shi'i mujtahids who did not believe that Christians should be allowed to build new churches. So the Shah looked after this particular community of Armenians extremely well. And we have farmans dating back to this time in which we can see the land grants. We have farmans in which we can see the Shah adjudicating in favor of the Armenians in land and water disputes with the neighboring Muslim villages whose land they were now occupying. In New Julfa, the Armenians formed a self-contained and self-governing community. It was a community that was run by a dozen or so rich merchant families who became known as the Hojas, the Julfa Hojas. And one of those Hojas was elected or appointed to be the headman, the Kalantar, who essentially acted as mayor of the community and as representative of the community to the Safavid authorities. In this, the Julfans were really continuing a tradition that was already established in Old Julfa, although Old Julfa had been an entirely Armenian town, but already by the 16th century it was a long, long time since Armenian towns had answered to Armenian political authorities. So the political authorities to whom the Julfans had answered had been the Khans of Nakhichevan. That had been the case at least as far back as the Ilkhanid era, and the Julfans were well accustomed to paying their taxes, to negotiating with those Khans, and indeed to playing a very useful role for those Khans. So Julfa, in certain periods, acted as the mint for Nakhichevan. So that, already we can see the commercial importance of the town. Also, before the Armenians ever came to Isfahan, we see the beginnings of a cross-cultural fertilization or a hybridity coming into the Armenian culture of the Julfans already in Old Julfa. This is, not much survives of Old Julfa, but one thing that survives or survived until recently were the gravestones of Old Julfa and the Khachkars. And whereas for hundreds of years the pattern of Armenian Khachkars had remained very distinct and very purely Armenian in style, the 16th century Julfa Khachkars have a very Islamicate look. There's a lot of crossover in terms of the decorative repertoire of these Khachkars with the Muslim art of the place they came from. So the Armenians are in a self-contained community, a self-governing community with all kinds of unusual privileges not enjoyed by other Armenians of the Safavid Empire, I hasten to say, so they're exclusive to them. And they are in the capital, and they have close relationships with the Shah and the Safavid court. They form, in some ways, a part of what is often referred to by historians as the Safavid third force. So this refers to the Ghulam cause, the mostly Caucasian Christians who Abbas I did not begin this practice. It was begun, in fact, under Tahmasp, but under Abbas I it expanded very, very extensively and was then continued by his successors through the 17th century. So these Ghulams, mostly Georgian, but some Circassians and some Armenians, were the Safavid equivalent of the Devshirme. It was a way of recruiting Christians into the administration and into the military. But it differed from Devshirme in a number of ways, and one of the most important of these ways was that these were people who were not taken as young children. They were often recruited as adults, and when they became part of the Safavid establishment, they were not expected to lose all their connection with their previous communities. In fact, the Georgians who were recruited into the Ghulam Corps often ended up going back to become governors or kings in Georgia again. So it's a variation on this system. And Abbas I relied very heavily on the Ghulams. He liked them, he promoted them to the top governor roles, the top general roles within the system for reasons that we won't go into now. And it's clear that in some way, or it appears that in some way, he looked at the Julfa Armenians as a kind of commercial arm of the same system. Now, the Julfa Armenians were not converts. They were not gholams. They remained Christian Armenians, and the Shah was, in fact, encouraging of their Christianity. He allocated craftsmen when they first arrived in Julfa to help them build their churches, and he himself took a keen interest even in their religious life. So the Shah started a practice, which was continued by later Shahs, of actually attending the outdoor Epiphany celebration on the banks of the Zayende River, and would participate in ways that I think must have been worrying and embarrassing and frankly quite disturbing to the Armenian priests. But it was a way that the Shah was showing that this Christian community was flourishing in his capital city under his protection and patronage. Why was he interested in having a commercial branch to this third force? Well, the Shah was a very ambitious man in terms of economy. He was very interested in securing the revenues of the state, and he decided to make the export of silk a royal monopoly. And he chose the Armenians, who were already, as I've discussed earlier, established as the principal merchants in this silk trade, as his royal agents. So he used them in this way. He used them often as ambassadors, because the role of ambassadors was often as much commercial as political. So he sent Julfa Armenians to European countries, also to Russia, and to other places. And he treated them well and formed a close relationship with them, invited them to court, visited them in their homes. So we have a situation in which this small community of Armenian merchants who came from a town which had probably maybe 2,000 or 3,000 houses, perhaps 10,000, 15,000 people, settled in a suburb of the imperial capital, which was a huge city already, growing very fast, not on the scale of Istanbul for sure, but a city whose population was measured in more than 100,000 anyway, we can say. And it was a highly cosmopolitan capital. And although the Armenians were living across the river in New Julfa, they had their shops and their workshops, and they did their business in the Grand Bazaar or in the Great Meydan in the center of Isfahan. And there they were meeting with all the people who were coming and going in Isfahan. Persians, Turks, Arabs, Indians, and increasingly large numbers of Europeans as well, craftsmen, missionaries, diplomats, travelers, soldier adventurers of all kinds. And we have a lot of information, a lot of evidence about how cosmopolitan, how culturally diverse Isfahan was in this time. It's a period when in the Safavid court and among Safavid elites there develops a keen taste in exotic art. So exotic art from China in the form of ceramics, exotic art from Europe in the shape of Venetian manufactures, and eventually by the second half of the 17th century, exotic art from Europe in the shape of European-style painting, which becomes incorporated into the Persian painting tradition. And in all of these areas, we find Armenians playing a role. So they are involved in this increasing cultural interaction in the Safavid court. In terms of their architecture, in terms of their dress, in terms of their cuisine, the Julfa Armenians become very Persian. The churches in New Julfa are built out of brick, and to the untutored eye, they look remarkably like Safavid mosques. They have the distinctive double dome, which is not a traditional part of Armenian church architecture. When you go inside them and look up, you see tile work that looks very much like the kind of tile work that you will find on the inside of a typical mosque dome. Their homes were built like the homes of the Safavid elite. The food they ate, which we know quite a lot about from accounts of people who were fortunate enough to dine with them, was also very similar to the food that was served at the tables of the wealthy, the sofres, I should say, of the wealthy of the Safavid elite. And they wore the same clothes, turbans, robes, as one would expect. In Europe, where they often went on business, the Julfa Armenians were very frequently mistaken for Persians, and we very often find Armenians being described as Persians, and quite often find Armenians who, when it suited them, found it was convenient to allow this misconception to continue and presented themselves as Persians to Europeans if that seemed to be a good idea at the time. So I spent some time talking about Isfahan because I think that Isfahan is in many ways the key to understanding how the Julfa Armenians go from being a small provincial community involved in one particular circuit of trade which went right through their town to being a globally significant merchant community. So in this sense, the coerced deportation from Old Julfa and the resettlement in Isfahan opened the way for them to operate on a global level and turned out to be a cloud with a very wide silver lining. By the mid-17th, late 17th and early 18th centuries, the new Julfa Armenians, from their home in the Safavid imperial capital, had extended their trade network through all of the main international trade circuits of the era. One European traveller of the 17th century compared Safavid Persia to a caravanserai with two doors. There was a door in the west which silver flowed in through, silver that came from the Mediterranean, mostly in the shape of European silver coin transported across the Ottoman Empire, much of it by Armenians. And then there was a gate at the east where all that silver and more flowed out again towards India. And with that flow of silver, the Armenians went too. And this is how the New Julfa Armenians get themselves to India, extending their business interests all the way across the subcontinent, so that by the late 17th century there are Armenians not just in Surat and Bombay on the west coast, but there are Armenians deep in the interior, in Agra, in Shah Jahanabad, in all of the major commercial cities, and even in Bengal, in Murshidabad first, when that's the capital of the Nawabs, and then later when the British arrive in Calcutta, the Armenians establish themselves. And onward, to Burma, to Siam, to Indonesia, even in the Philippines, there are not occasional travelers passing through, but established Armenian communities doing business, still business that is heavily involved in the flow of silver. This is silver that is coming the other way around the world, from the New World across the Pacific to Manila, and then entering the trade circuits of the Old World that way. And to the west, they are reaching Amsterdam, London, and also through Russia to Moscow and the White Sea and the Baltic. I think it's easy when looking at history to sort of know that things happened and then assume that it must have been that way, that it's sort of natural that that's the way it was. But I think we should stop and ask ourselves how likely it was in 1690 or in 1590 or 1600 that merchants from this small town on the banks of the Aras could achieve such an extraordinary expansion of their operations. No other Armenian community does anything like it in this period, travels so far from home, and no other Armenian community in this period achieves anything like the degree of commercial success. So in the late 17th century, these Julfa Armenians are compared by Europeans who surely knew to the great European merchant families and banking families. They're on that level of wealth and prominence. By the 1670s, they are signing trade agreements with the Romanov Tsars in Muscovy. They're signing trade agreements with the English East India Company. they are of a status where they can negotiate more or less as equals with governments and with East India companies. What are the Armenians making their money out of? They're not sending raw silk to India. So although they continued to be involved in that trade and continued to work on that westward circuit, they are also strongly associated, and from the previous paper you will not be surprised to hear, strongly associated with the trade in jewels. So precious stones and jewels are a very important commodity. And the Armenians early learned that if you can buy uncut precious stones from the mines in India, especially southern India, the Deccan, where diamonds were mined especially, and also in Burma and other places where rubies were, and transport the uncut stones all the way to Antwerp and get them cut using the latest European jewel cutting techniques and equipment, and then take them to Venice, where they do a better job than anyone else of setting them in beautiful gold and silver settings, and then re-export them to the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and Mughal India. You can make an awful lot of money. So jewels are very important indeed. But I don't want to suggest that these are merchants who are specialized entirely at the top end of the luxury market. In fact, if we read account books and letters and inventories, we find that the Armenians almost all seem to have been generalists. They actually bought and sold anything that would turn a profit. An awful lot of what they traded was textiles, like most merchants of the period. And this is the heyday of Indian textile manufacture, and the Armenians are trading Indian textiles, dyestuffs, foods, pretty well anything that you found on the circuits of trade that they frequented, you will find in the inventory of Armenian merchants. To return for a moment to John, who we left in Lhasa, if you remember. So John in Lhasa was trading Indian textiles for Chinese musk. But we also know that one of the reasons why a lot of merchants were going to Lhasa at that time was again connected with silver and gold. Indian silver rupees were traded in Lhasa for gold from China. So again, that silver flow that is such an important factor in old world trade at this time is important. So, what is the secret of the Julfan's trading success? I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of this, because otherwise I won't finish. So first, like most merchants in this period, the core building block of Julfa Armenian society and social and commercial organization is the family, the extended family, everybody living under one roof, all of the wealth, the capital of the family, held in common with a single patriarch in control. And this is a very common model, and it's a model which the Armenians shared. And when we look at the successful Hoxha families, we find that many of them were able to sustain their wealth over successive generations. Usually at a certain point, the unit becomes too big, and then part of it splits, and you get a new family name, but still, this is a very sustainable basic unit. The second point I want to emphasize is community. So the Julfa Armenian community, as I've suggested, was tight-knit. It was concentrated, it was living in this one special suburb. Muslims were not allowed to live in that suburb, so it was a tight-knit community with strong internal bonds of religion, language and culture to reinforce the Armenians' distinct identity and to encourage trust, honesty and cooperation among its members. We should also mention the role of the Armenian Church. We very often find that a family will have 2 or 3 merchant brothers and 1 priest brother. The priests play an important role as notaries for the documents, and the priests also play an important role in visiting or indeed becoming established in the new colonies, smaller sub-colonies that are set up overseas. Modern scholars of trade diaspora have stressed the importance of these characteristics, tight-knit, distinctive merchant communities in pre- and early modern trade. And those qualities are also given prominence by contemporary observers who talk about the Armenians' extraordinary capacity to work together, to be closed to the outside world when it suits them, to be impenetrable, and to interact effectively through their command of languages. So very, very strong command of languages, which again we can imagine was reinforced through that life in the capital, Isfahan. The community provided the pool of commercial associates through which the families could grow their businesses and become large corporations. And the community was also vital for information flow. I've talked about the Julfans trading in all kinds of communities, but as anyone who has tried to go into the bazaar in Istanbul and wonder what is the right price to pay for a souvenir to take back to England knows, buying stuff is easy, but buying and selling it at a profit is not easy. You need information. And the Armenians were extremely good at sharing this information. And there is a huge amount of correspondence between merchants, much of which deals with what price you can buy commodities at in one place and what price you can sell it at in another place. So this is the vital information that merchants need to be able to function across such a wide area and such a wide range of commodities. By the end of the 17th century, the Armenians are copying the European practice of writing merchant handbooks. So we actually get published handbooks almost as soon as there is printing among the Armenians, in which people set out, which commodities you should buy where, what are the places where you should trade this or that to. So, community is very important, and community is important also in the way in which it allows the Armenians to mediate their relationship with political authority. This system of a mayor who is partly elected by the community but partly appointed by the authority is one which proves very transportable. And so whenever the Armenian merchants establish themselves in a new place in India, first we imagine just a few merchants coming and going, then maybe one of them staying and acting as a kind of anchor point so that when others arrive there is somebody there who can help them. And then usually within a matter of a few years a priest will visit, and then if that community becomes established, a church will be built. And you get a little microcosm of the new Julfa community set up. So this is a model which functions. And it's a model which functions because it's been tried and tested already in Isfahan. And my contention is that you could not simply have taken that community from Old Julfa, where they were not living in the middle of a major trading city, and transported that. It took some decades in Isfahan before the Armenians understood or began to practice the establishment of small, similar communities elsewhere. Well, historians of trade diaspora often like to leave it there and tell us that what you need to be successful is a tight-knit trading community, ethnically and linguistically and religiously distinct. But however important the bonds of community may be, international trade involves, by definition, interaction not only with members of one's own community, but also with merchants, with brokers, with producers, with officials, transporters, purchasers from different communities, from other communities. And the Julfa Armenian documentary sources reveal numerous instances of business arrangements, contracts with members of other communities. It's true that the books of advice for merchants always advise Armenians, first of all, trust your family, then trust another Julfan. If you have to, go to a non-Julfa Armenian, only in extremis should you go outside the community. But the reality is that very often the Armenians were trading with others. A lot of those relationships were short-term and transactional, but some of them were long-term, many-year-long arrangements with Indian Saraf families or with partnership agreements with members of the Safavi elite. It is clear that there was a commercial culture which was understandable, recognizable and applicable and enforceable for all of these communities to be able to develop long-term relationships of trust. It's interesting to look at the Armenian documents because very often they involve other languages. I mean, the vocabulary is in any case very largely Islamic. It's Persian, Arabic and Shadi in character, which suggests that the Armenians are operating essentially within a Shadi commercial law. But sometimes the documents are bilingual, Persian on one side, Armenian on the other. Often the signatures include people signing in different languages from different communities. And quite often the documents state, we wrote this document in 3 copies, one in Arabic, one in Persian, and one in Armenian. It doesn't explain why that is done, but to me it seems the most likely explanation is that Arabic is if you end up in a Shadi court, Persian is if you end up in front of the local governor in or in India or Iran, and remember India is a Persian-speaking country at this time, and Armenian if you're arbitrating it within the community. That speaks, of course, to the linguistic capability of these Armenian merchants, and there is much more proof of that scattered throughout the documents. John, again, to come back to it once more, in Tibet, includes quite a lot of words from Tibetan transcribed in the Armenian script in his account book. How much Tibetan he knew, I don't know, probably only a few key words, but it does show that he was comfortable even in a language that most of us would run from if we were expected to try to learn. I'm not going to talk more because I think, how long do I have?
Okay, 1 minute actually, but if you need 5, no problem. Go ahead.
I'll take 3.
Okay.
It's a commercial subject.
Yeah, as good as the Jupan
Negotiation should be. Okay. So, I won't say more about their commercial practice or what helped them succeed, except to say that the Armenians are thoroughly modern in their commercial practice. So, again, if we want to think about how they are doing business in every way in as sophisticated a manner, using as sophisticated financial instruments and as sophisticated contractual forms as European merchants are using at the time. And I'll leave it there. And this is why I think John is so disgusted when he loses this court case on the roll of a dice, because he considers this to be a very primitive and unsatisfactory way of mediating commercial disagreements. So I thought I wouldn't have much time for intellectual cultural exchanges. I don't have really any time at all. But I just want to say that the Armenians in India, in Iran, but in India as well, are, while retaining those close bonds of community, very quickly integrated and in interaction with members of the first Muslim elites who rule India, and then as the Europeans take over in the course of the 18th century, in very close connection with the Europeans. And India becomes one of the main places in which Armenian intellectuals encounter the ideas of the European Enlightenment and plays a very important role in the Armenian awakening in the 18th century. So it's an important story. So I'm going to conclude. I took my task here to be the global context, which is a part of what we're doing. And I hope I've been able to show the global context in which these Armenian merchants reached India. It's a context which in economic terms is about circuits of trade which I think all historians would now agree undergo a period of very great vitality in this early modern period, connected with, although not exclusively a result of, the flows of New World silver that greased the wheels of trade all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. It's a global political context in which we have the empires that Hodgson referred to as the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, Safavids and Mughals, and this creates more stability, and more certainty, and therefore greater ease for merchants to move long distances than in most preceding centuries. And there's a global cultural context, which I've hinted at, which we could use the now fashionable, also Hodgson invented term Persianate to describe. By learning to be so comfortable in Isfahan, the Armenians effectively learned how to be comfortable all the way to Bengal and indeed beyond. And so this is a cultural context which allowed them to move so far. The association of Armenians with trade, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, we should not take for granted. It's not a matter of genetic predisposition, it's a product of circumstances. The Julfa Armenians are an extraordinary commercial success story in a very particular set of circumstances. I've tried to argue here that among the other more familiar factors for that success, we should take the relocation of that community from their hometown on the Aras to the Safavi capital, Isfahan, as a crucial factor in their transformation from being a successful single-circuit trading community to joining the Premier League of international merchants operating on a truly global scale. The Julfa Armenians were not the Ottoman Armenians, and it would be a mistake to suggest that there are too many similarities between them. But I do think we could learn a lot by making comparisons between the Julfa Hojas and the Istanbul Amirs. I think we will find some interesting parallels in the political domain, in the cultural domain, and also in the intellectual experiences of these two important Armenian communities, which played such an important part in the lives of these two great cosmopolitan capital cities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. The task is accomplished, more than accomplished actually. Thank you for this very exhaustive and informative talk, also very analytical. It's important actually to give this presentation here in Istanbul because usually that segment of Armenian history is very much neglected in this country, and that was really very helpful. I hope this will encourage some young scholars to do some work on the, let's say, that part of Armenian history. Şimdi soru, cevap, yorum alacağız. Hemen oradan bir el kalktı. Suriye hocama hemen vereyim, yakın olduğu için. Torpil değil.
Well, thank you very much. And I have, you say that, people should be encouraged to look into the nooks and crannies of this trade. And I have something that puzzles me very much. In the Crafts Museum in Delhi, in the textile section, there is a rather spectacular cloth hanging, obviously meant for a church, showing the Old Testamentary scene of Moses, I think, defeating some kind of dragon-like creature. And the descriptions of the various people, and including the dragon, are written in a very Persianite Arabic script. But visibly, this is a Christian piece. I have tried to find, people in Delhi who might be interested. I talked to a woman who's a textile expert, and I talked to a man who is a historian of trade and a priest to boot, and both of them kind of shrugged it off. It was not part of their bailiwick, visibly. And I was wondering whether this piece in the Crafts Museum is really that unique, or if there are others, where they are, and whether if there is a distribution of these kinds of church ornaments, whether they come directly from New Julfa, or because they're cottons, somehow you think, well, maybe they're Indian. But is there anybody who knows something about this?
Thank you. I haven't seen that piece, so I must have missed it when I was in the Delhi Museum. I was obviously too weak.
You are not heard without micro. Didn't hear, but okay, go ahead.
So I can't speak to it, and I haven't seen such a fabric with Persian script, but they are very common, quite common in Armenian script, and mostly they are made in Coromandel, so they are, a lot of them are Coromandel textiles, made as altar cloths and sent west. So I look forward to seeing it, and I will probably consult Muzaffar Alam, who is always the person I would go to try and get anything difficult in Persian from India.
Let's have the second question.
Bu konuşmanızın ikinci bölümünde cemaat kavramına başladığınızda Müslümanların belli bir şehirde sevaptı galiba, yanlış hatırlamıyorsam, yaşayamadığını falan söyledi. Sanki evvelce Mehmet Hoca Getülaşma yok demişti. Orayı ben mi kaçırdım yoksa yanlış anladım? Tekrar eder misiniz? Bir aydınlatır mısınız?
Clearly a misunderstanding. I said that when the Armenians were settled in New Julfa in Isfahan, it was an exclusively Christian suburb. And it remained an exclusively Christian suburb for some time, but not in fact right through the Safavid period. And it's not a subject that I had time to talk about today, but in fact one of the effects of this cosmopolitanism and this interaction between different communities in Isfahan was that a number of Armenians converted to Islam in the course of the 17th century. Sometimes they were coerced, sometimes they were induced with economic inducements, and some of them, I believe, converted genuinely out of conviction. So they found the Islamic faith attractive. And those people then stayed in Julfa, and so the purely Christian quality of the suburb was lost before the end of the 17th century. But it certainly was the case that in the early period, this suburb of Isfahan, New Julfa, was built and intended as a purely Armenian, purely Christian community.
Hocam konuşmanız için teşekkür ediyorum. Ben Ersen Yarman. İki sualim olacak müsaade ederseniz. Birincisi 1600'ün ikinci yarısında, 16. asrın ikinci yarısında Julfa'dan bir heyet Rusya'ya taht hediyesi götürüyor. Benim yaptığım şahsi araştırmalarda Ermeni kaynaklar, Batılı kaynaklar, İranlı kaynaklar ve hatta Rusya kaynaklar farklı bir tez öne sürüyor. Yani Ermeniler kendileri için Rusya'ya gittiler ve Tsar'a hediye takdim ettiler. Kimileri de İran adına gittiler şeklinde raporlar var. Ben bunların arasında bir ikilem içinde kaldım, çözemedim. Bu konuda bana bir yardımcı olur musunuz? İkincisi, İran'da kuyumculuğu Ermeniler Osmanlı Ermenilerinden 100 sene daha evvel ele geçirdiler. Bilahare Hindistan'a geçip taş ticareti yaptılar. Burada yine bir ikileme rastlıyorum. Taş ticareti yaptıkları halde, İran'da da kuyumculuk çok önemli olduğu halde Hindistan'da niye kuyumcu olmadılar? Yani imalatçı olmadılar veya oldularsa ben bilmiyorum, bilmek istiyorum. Teşekkürler.
I will try to answer both questions. So I didn't talk about Russia because I bored you for long enough about the routes of trade, but it is certainly the case that the Julfa Armenians went to Russia. This was essentially a different route for transporting the same raw silk to European markets. So the main route was across the Ottoman Empire to the Mediterranean, but a second route was opened up, in fact, quite early, really as soon as the Russians, or as soon after the Russians reached the Caspian Sea. Some merchants thought that there would be an opportunity to ship the raw silk that was produced in the provinces close to the Caspian Sea, to ship it across the Caspian and then to take it up the Russian river system and onto Europe that way. And Armenians took part in that trade. And at certain times, as I said, they signed agreements late in the 17th century, signed agreements with the court in Muscovy to actually divert the trade in that direction. They went both independently as merchants and they went as royal envoys. So throughout the 17th century, well, 16th and 17th century, we find quite a number of large embassies exchanged between Russia and the Safavids, between Muscovy and the Safavids. And it's one of the problems of our historiography that because we are much more comfortable with English and French and German sources, and there are many more of them, we tend to always exaggerate the importance of the West European states in relations with the Safavids and to downplay the importance of the Russians. But these embassies were enormous and involved many hundreds of people traveling, and most of them were really there on business. And the great advantage of going as part of an embassy was that you didn't pay any duties. And when the embassy arrived, a detailed inventory and costing would be made of all of the products that the embassy had brought, and then a similar value of products would be sent back the other way. So the Armenians were a part of that. So they went both as individual merchants at other times, but they also took part in these embassies. There's one very important moment, and it does also connect to your second question, which is the gift of a very splendid throne to the court in Muscovy in the late 17th century. It's known as the Diamond Throne. It's still one of the prized exhibits in the Kremlin Museum. And this is an interesting story, and I had the opportunity to research this in the archives in Moscow. I've never actually seen the throne because it was under remont at the time. But anyway, I've researched the story. It's clear that initially the Armenians were sent as agents, not of the Shah, but of the Grand Vizier, the Etemad-ı-Dowle. And he offered this throne to the Romanov Tsar, who wanted it. And he then commissioned Armenians to get it made, and they made it in India. And the throne, if you look at it, is very Indian in style, and it's a jewel-encrusted, very, very ornate throne. So I don't know whether those jewels were cut in India or whether they had been cut in Europe and taken back to India. But I didn't mean to suggest that every single diamond that was taken out of the ground in Hyderabad went to Antwerp to be cut. I just was trying to give a sense of how extraordinarily extensive this trade network was, and how one could count on transporting goods and processing goods over a very long distance. But certainly the Indians were also skilled jewelsmiths, jewelry makers, and the Iranians too. So this throne was made, but somehow by the time the Armenians delivered it in Muscovy, I think that Etemad-ı-Dowle had moved on, shall we say. They usually moved on unhappily to an early death. And the Armenians gave the throne as if it were on their own behalf. And so the diamond throne, if you look at Russian sources, they record this as a gift of the Armenian people to the Russian throne. Well, this is a kind of Soviet nonsense of, friendship of the people. The Armenian people were in no position to give anything in the 17th century. It was a gift from these wealthy Armenian merchants who had effectively taken over, I would guess, the cost as well as the responsibility to deliver a throne that had effectively been ordered from the Safavids by the Muscovy court. And the Persian jewelry, I mean, I hope I've answered that question in a way. Certainly they were making jewels in India and Iran as well. But this is a period where in a number of areas European technology and techniques develop, and the cutting of precious stones is one that you probably know more about than me, where different ways of cutting stones are discovered which bring the light better from the interior of the stone. And so this is why Antwerp was considered the best place of all to have your stones cut in this era.
Okay, we've got one more.
I have a question. Is there any information regarding any possible trade and finance ties between the Amira element in Istanbul and the Indian communities, let's say?
I haven't come across any in the materials I've looked at, but I think there probably is. I mean, Constantinople isn't a major place on the trade circuits I've been talking about, but there is, in Venice, there is a lot of Armenian material. It's one of the big places where these documents survive. And there's a lot of material written by one Armenian called Hayrapet, who is trading diamonds, mostly around the Eastern Mediterranean. And he has correspondence in Constantinople. So Constantinople is very much one of the places he's working with. But I'm afraid I haven't looked at those materials. One of you who's learning Armenian needs to go and look at this stuff, because the connection would be a very interesting one to make, and it just doesn't happen to have featured in the documents that I've looked at myself.
Ben bir soru değil de bir katkı sunmak istiyorum. Madem ki hem Çulfa'dan bahsettik hem ben soru değil de bir katkı koymak istiyorum. Çulfa'dan, Yeni Çulfa'dan bahsettik ve Hindistan'ın pek çok şehrinden bahsettik. Buralar aynı zamanda Ermeni dilinin, edebiyatının geliştiği merkezler. Bunu bir kenara koymak gerekiyor. Yani ilk Ermence gazetenin Hindistan'ın Madras şehrinde yayınlandığını düşünürsek özel bir anlamı olsa gerek. Başka bir nokta, sadece Çulfa ya da Hindistan Madras değil, pek çok başka yerde de, buna İstanbul'da dahil tarihi olarak Ermeni tüccarlarıyla Ermeni edebiyatı, sanatı ve gelişmesi arasında müthiş bir ilişki var. Ermeni tüccarlar her yerde Ermeni dilinin gelişmesi, Ermeni sanatının gelişmesi için olağanüstü katkılarda bulunmuşlardır. Bu Moskova'da da böyledir, İstanbul'da da böyledir, Çulpa'da da böyledir, Venedik'te de böyledir. Hindistan Ermeniler açısından çok özel bir yere sahip. İki cümle daha söyleyip bitireceğim. Birazcık şöyle düşünelim. Ermeni aydınları, çünkü Ermenilerin Hindistan'da üniversiteleri var. Hindistan'da bir dönem Moğolların egemen olduğu tarihlerde aynen Osmanlı'da olduğu gibi saray hekimi, saray mimarı gibi çok önemli roller üstlenmişler. Ermeniler, oradaki aydınların bir derdi var. Ermenilerin hali ne olacak diye dert edilmişler o tarihte. Ve şunu söylemek mümkün, ilk defa Ermenilere yönelik bir anayasa hazırlamışlardır. Bir cumhuriyet anayasası hazırlamışlardır. Ne yazık ki sonu gelmemiştir. Bu anayasanın orijinal örnekleri var. Teşekkür ederim.
I can only thank you for saying the things that I didn't have time to say myself because of my poor time management in my paper. So this was very much what I would have said about the intellectual connection.
I think one last question.
I would like to learn among the Armenian communities in Persian communities, were there any trade unions first? And the second small question, what was the first reason Shah Abbas gave so many privileges or protection to the Armenian communities in Çul?
Trade unions, if you mean in a modern sense, then not until the modern era. If you mean
Lodge'dan guilds.
if you mean synth, sort of traditional professional associations, only the merchants seem to have acted collectively, and really they acted collectively as a community. So it's an interesting subject which we are just beginning to understand a bit more about. The heads of the community were all of them the heads of the main merchant houses, and they acted as the government of New Julfa, they represented New Julfa when they needed to, and they did at certain times. So there was one occasion, for example, when one of the Safavid Shahs was threatening the Armenians in a certain way, and they acted collectively and threatened not to bring the caravans back from Aleppo with the silver unless, they were able to negotiate collectively in that way. When we see them signing these trade agreements with Russia, we can see the signatures of each of the heads of the quarters of New Julfa, and each of those heads is one of the major merchant families. And similarly, we see it when we witness the arbitration of commercial disputes within the community, and we see the signatures of all of the heads, signing the verdict, the resolution of the community in relation to disputes. So they function not so much as a trade union, but they do work in that way. I forgot your second question, I'm sorry. Well, I think he didn't protect all of the Armenians. I want to make this very clear. I have not been giving you a social history of the Armenians. If this was a social history of the City of London, I've only told you the social history of the top 5% of bankers. For most Armenians, the experience of Safavid rule was not such a comfortable or pleasant one. But he liked them because they were in the silk trade, and he wanted to make it a monopoly. He wanted to use them to build his empire. He wanted to use them as his agents. He had some bad experiences entrusting consignments of silk to send to European courts with Muslim ambassadors. So he had his fingers burnt with the Spanish once badly. The Spanish said thank you very much for the silk, but didn't send anything back in return, which was not the rules of the game at all. So he thought the Armenians would be more reliable, and the relationship, later Shahs were not so personally engaged, but still, broadly speaking, the same symbiotic arrangement continued.
Thank you very much, really. The last two speeches gave us a very good picture of the global context. I think we have got one more question. Just because we have got such a long lunch break, let's have this last question from Ali.
Şah Abbas'ın Julfa'dan Nor Julfa'ya Ermenileri transfer etmesi bir tehcir gibi görülüyor, değerlendiriliyor, öyle nitelendiriliyor. Bununla ilgili Ermeni kaynaklarındaki rakamlar çok ihtilaflı. 4.000, 40.000 ve hatta 400.000 gibi rakamlar var aileleriyle birlikte. Bu rakamla ilgili sizin herhangi bir açıklamanız olabilir mi? Bir de şeyi soracağım. Bu Hoca Çelebi ve İkincisi de Hoca Çelebi ve Kalantar'dan bahsettiniz. Bu çok özgün bir ticari elit yaratıyor Şah Abbas. Fakat bu ünvanlar diyelim 11. yüzyıldan itibaren Ermeni aristokrasisiyle, soylularıyla ilgili bir şey mi? Oradan mı türetilmiş bir şey, yoksa Şah Abbas'ın daha kendi özgün idari, ticari birimleri mi? Bir de onu öğrenmek istedim. Teşekkür ederim.
So, number of deportees, it's extremely difficult to calculate. As you say, the sources are very varied, and the sources are probably talking about very different things. So some of them are eyewitness accounts of people who have seen perhaps one large column of deportees being driven before their eyes along the road. Others are attempts to add up information from sources that they've heard about of how many people might have been transferred or deported across the whole territory. I treat these figures rather like I treat the figures of how many people were killed when the Mongols sacked cities in the 13th century. I think we should not try to consider them accurate statistics, but we should understand them rather as expressions of shock on behalf of the witnesses. So, you know, this deportation was something that had been practiced for a long time, for many times, and this deportation under Abbas I was called the Metzsurgul, the big deportation, the great deportation. And the figures that are given for the numbers of people are much higher than for other deportations. So I think this tells us that, at least compared to what had come before, this was a very big and a very traumatic experience. But I wouldn't care to put numbers on it. In terms of aristocracy, it's quite, when the Armenian, so the same people who were the heads of the merchant houses in New Julfa, as far as we can trace them back to Old Julfa, were also prominent families in Old Julfa. And in Old Julfa, and in the very early years in New Julfa, they are sometimes referred to as Ishkhan. Even Takavor we find used in Armenian sources, so this means prince or king. But these were not members of the, you know, Bagratid or other royal houses. These were simply names used within the community for whoever was the head. And in the Safavid system, there is no doubt that the Persian sources call these people kalantar, and that's the normal word for the mayor of any community, right down to village level. So this is not, you know, the Armenians may have liked to build themselves up a bit, as we all do, but they were not considered royalty by their contemporaries. I mean, the way that the ordinary Armenians viewed them was also often with quite mixed emotions. So if we get to the 18th century, we find some folk literature which tells us, you know, that the Khojas were considered pretty tough as masters. There's one poem which has a line that the Khojas could split a hair with an account book. So I imagine that this is somebody who has come back from, you know, as the agent of one of these big families and has been given a very tough time over his accounts and whether he's brought back as much money as he should have done. And he's recording, you know, this not very positive impression of the Khojas. So you know, they're an elite, but they are really a commercial elite, and in our terms, a bourgeois elite rather than a royal or aristocratic elite. They're not landholders, and they don't have any of the regalia of royalty, and of course they don't have a coinage or any of those other marks of statehood and symbols of royalty.
Okay, I think that
Was it? Thank you very much again.